In honor of Amudim's campaign, I would like to talk about a famous concept within the realm of Torah study, which is the idea of Torah Lishma. Using fancy phrasing that Dr. Goldstein taught me during my Shana Ba'aretz, this would mean Torah qua Torah. Slightly simpler language would be Torah for its own sake, Torah for the sake of Torah. Within this concept, there's a famous phrase, mitoch shelo lishma, balishma. Through engaging in this endeavor, in this example Torah study, not for its own sake, one may come to engage in it for its own sake. I would like to explore what this phrase might mean and some insight that we can gain about it using an appearance of it within the context of the mitzvah of rebuke, as found in Masechet Arachin on Daf Tetzayin Amud Bet, that's Daf 16b. So there's a positive commandment to rebuke a fellow when they are doing something improperly. Rabbi Tarfon and Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah both conclude that this is impossible in the society they see. One of them saying that people don't know how to give rebuke anymore. One of them saying that people don't know how to receive rebuke anymore. And the Gemara follows this conversation by a question that seems hard to relate. The question is, given a choice between rebuke for its own sake and humility not for its own sake, which would we prefer? I'm going to offer an interpretation of what these two phrases might mean in this context, but I'm by no means an authority. Rebuke for its own sake is probably engaging in rebuke for the sake of the mitzvah, right? It's not about ego. It's not about trying to show your friend that they're worse than you are or that they're an improper person. It's just giving them feedback. Humility not for its own sake is a bit harder. Humility in general in the scheme of rebuke probably fits into the ability to receive rebuke and give rebuke. Giving rebuke in the sense that it's not about making yourself feel greater than somebody else, but probably more relevantly in the idea of receiving rebuke, to understand that it's humility, to be humble in your ability to take it, and therefore humility not for its own sake is probably the ability to receive rebuke even when you're not sure it's fitting, even when you're not necessarily ready to hear it, but nonetheless receiving it. So the Gemara's answer is we obviously prefer humility, and even if we cannot engage in humility for its own sake, we hope that we will come to engage in it for its sake. How do we know? We have the saying when it comes to Torah and mitzvot, mitoch shelo lishma, balishma. Through engaging in it not for its own sake, we may come to engage in it for its own sake. So what does that mean in the context of humility and rebuke? And how can that help us understand how we use this phrase when it comes to Torah study? Well, rebuke here is a religious commandment, but a social one. We're looking to create a society in which people can engage openly in an idea, in a world of constructive criticism, and really help each other grow and look out for each other in terms of their observance. How does that fit into Torah study? What does Torah study for its own sake even mean? There's a general philosophical disagreement in terms of whether anything can really be intrinsically, right, good, and good for its own sake. It's much easier to see things as instrumentally good for the sake of something that they give us. When it comes to Torah study, good for some instrumental goods that may come through it is the idea of connection to God, of connection to our heritage, of building scholarship. In the context of Amudim, it's about building a group of like-minded peers. It's about really building yourself. But there also is just a value of engaging in Torah for its own sake. We come to learn because we really believe that Torah just needs to be studied. And if there is anything about Torah study that's intrinsic, that's probably the closest that we can get. So that's some ideas about Torah Lishma on its own. But what do we see about Torah Lishma given its relationship to rebuke and its connection to rebuke and humility? I would like to venture that maybe we're learning about some social import of Torah for its own sake, that we want to create a society of people who engage in Torah for its own sake. We want to create a society and a social circle in which people have humility, are working together on their Torah mitzvot, and really engaging in Torah and because it's a value, engaging in other values because it's a value. Yes, because of the instrumental benefit that it brings them, because of the connection to God, because of the heritage that is growing, but also just because of its own beauty.